مساء الخير جميعا. Good evening everyone. It's a pleasure to have you for our session 3 in the data analytics webinar. Session 3 is about combating fraud using data analytics. As explained in the previous 2 sessions, session 1 was just an introductory session to pave the way for sessions 2 and 3. In session 2, we saw some practical examples, and we also saw some advanced analytical techniques as well, and the future of data analytics. Session 3 mainly concentrates on combating fraud, and it provides a number of practical examples on combating fraud. So I'll start with thanking the Institute of Internal Audit Jordan and the president, Mr. Ahmed Al-Qawasmi, ISACA Amman Chapter, and Mr. Husam Al-Khattab, the president, Mr. Nasim Qarmash, the president of IMA-Jordan, and Iman Boutai, the operations manager at IMA-Jordan as well. Thank you and for making this happen. Let me just start by going through the contents with you. And as we go through the contents, I'm going to explain who's going to be covering what. So the first part, the first 3 parts will be covered by my colleague, Zaid Ubaidallah. In session 1, I presented him. He's a director with our firm, and he's a specialist data analytics expert, CIA, CFE, and also CIDA, Certified IDEA Data Analytics Professional. He will start by providing a background on fraud. Then he will talk about detecting fraud. He will then move on to some practical examples about IT login fraud. Mr. Hisham El-Yafi, again, one of our data analytics experts, is a senior consultant with our firm, will cover the part of HR and payroll fraud. And finally, Uthman will cover the procurement fraud before he moves on to data analytics and reporting. Uthman is a supervisor consultant with our firm, and he is also a data analytics expert. I come in the end to the closing session and to talk about how you can unlock the potential of data analytics in your organization. So I'll move we'll move now with Zaid to take over and start the presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Nasser, for the introduction. Good evening, everybody. I'm Zaid Ubaidallah, and I'm here to talk to you about how to use data analytics to combat fraud. Now, if you remember from the time when we were in session 1, when we talked about the steps of the data analytical process. Now, when we said at that point that the data analytical process starts with having a complete understanding of the objective and the desired result. So when we want to use data analytics for fraud, we need, first of all, to have an understanding of fraud. What does fraud mean? What are the types of schemes that are possible to be committed? So to talk about that, first we're going to be talking about a background on fraud. Now, basically, based on the ACFE's 2020 report to the nations, it was highlighted that companies lose 5% of their revenue to fraud in each year. In the Middle East alone, the average loss from fraud cases in 2020 was $1.3 million, which is quite a substantial amount for any company. The median duration of a fraud scheme was considered to be 12 months, with the most common occupational fraud scheme to be under the category of corruption. So having known that, what do we exactly mean when we say fraud? Basically, fraud is defined by the causal framework as any intentional act or omission designed to deceive others, resulting in the victim suffering a loss and or the perpetrator achieving a gain. So that would mean that fraud would include any intentional or deliberate act to deprive another party of their property or money. This is going to be done using deception or any other unfair means. But this is just a very general overview of the definition of fraud. When we talk about the types of fraud, fraud can be covered in so many categories. So the fraud tree as designed by the ACFE describes fraud as one of three main categories. Corruption, which is basically the use of influence in business transactions for personal benefits or bribery. This can also include procurement fraud, or asset misappropriation, which includes fraudulent expenditures or theft. And finally, financial statement fraud, which includes fraudulent misstatement or omission of information from the financial statement. What you see in front of you is just an overview of the three types. And still, fraud is still so complicated that when we talk about asset misappropriation, for example, on its own, it can still be broken down into several schemes. That's how big fraud is in the various schemes that it talks about. And when we want to talk about fraud, we need to understand the factors that would relate to the occurrence of a fraud situation. So that's where the fraud triangle comes into the picture. The fraud triangle is made up of the three factors that would usually explain the motivation behind the fraud case. The first motivation is, or the first factor is the opportunity to create fraud. Opportunities are usually created by having a weak internal control system or a poor security over company property or a little fear of exposure or likelihood of detection. Another factor would be the incentive to commit fraud. The incentive comes back to the mindset of the perpetrator of the fraud. It's when a person's circumstances would create pressure that would lead him to find or to seek an opportunity when it appears. This can be a financial pressure, work pressure, or just a family or peer pressure. And lastly, the rationalization to commit fraud. This is the ability for the perpetrator to justify or persuade himself that the activity that he has undertaken is acceptable. Such examples would include that I don't get paid what I am worth, or I am just borrowing the money, or this is basically a victimless activity, or it is justified due to my mistreatment. So what you are looking for is a situation where all of these factors are available in order to allow for the fraud scheme to take place. So when you are working your way through detecting fraud or preventing fraud, you are basically going through the concept of taking away one of these three factors. So this takes us to our very first poll question. An employee has noted that there is no segregation of duties between recording and verifying check payments. Which element of the fraud triangle does this relate to? Opportunity, rationalization, or incentive? And I am opening the poll now. And as many of you would have guessed it, the majority of you came up with the fact that this would represent an opportunity because it represents a potential weakness in the control that can be exposed. Having known that, it is time to start talking about methods of detecting fraud. So when we are talking about detective frauds, companies would usually rely on several methods, including obviously the data analytical tool. So if we want to ask you another question in your organization or based on your knowledge, let's ask ourselves the second poll question. What do you believe are the most common three methods of detecting fraud? And allow me to open the poll question now. Now, what this question brought up is actually quite a lot of interesting information. So as you can see that the majority of you believe that internal audit would be the most common method of detecting fraud, followed by tips or whistleblowers, and then account reconciliation, closely followed by the incident information. In the ACFE's results or report to the nation, it was actually detected that in their survey, 43% of the fraud cases were actually detected by whistleblowers or accident tips. So as you can see, this had some significantly low reliance on internal audit and management review. Now, from a perspective of a data analyst, it is not enough to rely on somebody else to by accident stumble on some kind of evidence or fraud in order for them to report it. That's why it is important for you as a data analyst to improve your method of fraud detection so that you should be able to better rely on your own techniques to detect fraud rather than waiting for an accident to happen that would allow someone to blow the whistle on the potential issue. Now, if we want to talk about how are we going to identify the potential fraud case, it would link back to the same 6 steps that we have covered in the first session. In the first session, we always go back to the very first step, which is understanding your objective and the result that you are trying to achieve it. In order to build this understanding, you need to either determine the fraud scheme, the possible fraud scheme that you are going to investigate, or you need to have a complete understanding of the operational area that you are going to work in. Both situations would allow you to reach the potential red flags and indicators associated with that scheme or area. This will help you build your own audit steps, the steps that you require to follow in order to reach the potential conclusion and reach or conduct a further inquiry if you actually detect any kind of red flags. Once an actual fraud event has been identified, this would allow you to initiate the entire fraud investigation process. Now, having built this background with regards to fraud, it is time to ask ourselves, how are we going to actually use data analytics in detecting fraud? The 3 schemes that we have selected for you, which is IT login fraud, HR and payroll, and another scheme in procurement, has been selected as a sample of the schemes that, of the data analytics over a potential fraud scenario. But as you saw, the fraud tree is quite big. So you need to understand the method of how you are going to reach to the same steps in order to assist you in conducting your fraud investigation and the relevant data analytics. So when we are talking about the IT login fraud, it can take place in various ways. For example, when an unauthorized person would gain access to an internal IT system just to seek illegal access to the information or to log in data from an external party or breach the firewall. So potential red flags for such a scenario would include, for example, that ex-employees still have access to the system, or that the entry to the system at periods which are not exactly defined as normal working hours. Similarly, like an employee accessing the system on a weekend, when that employee does not require access to the system on a weekend, or simply logging into the company's systems from an asset that is not registered as an asset that belongs to the company. So before we dig into our practical example, I want to ask you another poll question. You have been tasked to identify unauthorized access to the company's internal system by employees on vacations. What kind of information do you need to verify this information? This question would link us back again to the 6 steps required to conduct any kind of data analytics. The first step was to understand the objective, which is available with us here, that we are required to identify unauthorized access. And then we are required to understand what kind of information do we need in order to conduct our investigation. So let's see what you think on this area, and I will open the polls to you now. And let's see what came up in the results. So what the majority of you came up with is that, first of all, we need access to the system access log and the list of vacation by employee, which is basically the correct answer for such a scenario. Because if we want to ask ourselves, what is the scenario? It is that we want to identify unauthorized access by employees on vacation. So to do that, we need to have the system access log that would allow us to know who came into the system. And then we would need to know the employees who were on vacation that would allow us to compare against the system access log to extract the required information. So let's see the practical example. You work as an auditor in a company that supplies contract cleaning services. You noted that one purchase order in the month of February was approved by a departing employee during your audit on procurement function. This transaction raised your suspicion that unauthorized access to company internal system is actually taking place. And accordingly, you started, or you were requested to start an investigation to see whether any anomalies or suspicious behavior has been taking place. So for that, let's build the objectives. So let's start asking ourselves, what is it that we actually need, what is the result that we are trying to achieve? So the first question is going to be, have there been any logins by users who have actually left the company? So that's one. Another one can be, since potentially there is access by a person who has left the company, it's not a bad idea to see if there are any people who have left, who are accessing the company outside the normal working hours. And since we are talking about the normal working hours, it's also not a bad idea to check if anyone have been accessing the records on a weekend. And lastly, since the employee has already left the company, it probably means that he did not use his assigned asset. So we can also check whether there has been any logins made to the company from an asset that does not belong to the company. So having built this objective in mind, let's start asking ourselves, what do we really need as information in order to be able to achieve this objective? So for this review, we'll probably be needing the employees master file, the complete list of employees available in the company. We would also need to have the current asset list, which will include the assets that have the authority to access the system. We also need the list of the people who have departed the company. And lastly, we need the logins report. Since we noted the issue in February, let's take the login report for February. And this is the objective that we are trying to reach. Again, we are talking about, as we said, the login ID being used after an employee has left the company's employment, the login ID used outside of normal working hours, the ID used at weekends, but only for employees who are not registered to work at weekends, and login IDs used on a PC where the login is not the registered user for that asset. Now, for the purpose of this exercise, I will be using Caseware IDEA for my analytical purposes. Now, you can see here that I have already imported the 4 files that I need to conduct my analysis. So let's just have a quick preview on each one. The list of current assets shows the asset ID, PC name, the employee ID and name that is linked to this PC, workstation, and asset assigned date and return date if the employee left the company. Then we have a list of the current employees along with their login ID and whether or not they are authorized to work on a weekend. So you can see that there's a Y or an N to indicate whether the employee can work on a weekend. And we have the joining date here as well. In the ex-employees, it's similar to the current employees, but it also has a leaving date. So in the current employees, all of the leaving date is appearing as blank because obviously they did not leave yet. And lastly, we have the February login report that would highlight what is the PC name and the event date of the activity that has taken place of the login and the login ID that took place in February. So we want to start our analysis. How are we going to do that? First of all, since we have two lists for employees, it's not a bad idea to have a single list to include all of our employees. So what I did at the beginning is just I need to give an identifier to the current employees. And I did that by adding a new column and highlighting that these are the current employees and highlighting a column at this list showing that these are the ex-employees. So after that, I just appended these two databases together and I got a database with 99 records showing whether these employees were ex-employees or current employees. But obviously, this is not just enough. We need to know what is the PC linked to each one of these employees. So to do that, I had to link this database with the current asset list database. So in IDEA, I have a ready-made feature, which is the tool that would assist me to conduct my analysis. I have linked between these two databases using the employee ID as a key with a request that I need to have all records in the original file. So having done that, I have prepared the file which shows the employees linked to their relevant PCs in a complete section at the end of my database. But still, I am not really done yet at this point, because what I need is actually to analyze the login reports against the February file. So I have the employees, the current and ex-employees and their PCs. I need to know which one of these employees accessed the company's records in February. So to do that, I have opened I used the February file. I do apologize if this is a bit technical, but this is just the step that we need to do in order to conduct our analysis. And we have merged between the February login file and the employee linked file based on a unique identifier in order to have one complete file that has all of our employees, it has all of the relevant PCs, and we know that these employees are the ones who did access the system in February. Now comes the actual analysis, because everything that we have done up to this step was basically preparing the data. We were just preparing the file that we need to work with in order to extract the information that we need and reach our assigned objective. Remember our first objective. Our first objective was finding ex-employees who left after the leaving date. So what I did here is I built a criteria or a condition. I applied that in IDEA system, where I asked the system to identify any events where they were bigger than the leaving date. That means that event date is the date of the login. So I'm looking for any dates of the login bigger than, which in date terms, it means subsequent to the leaving date. But since we do not want the current employees, we are excluding everything that has a blank leaving date. Having done that, the system has identified for me that there have been 50 login and logouts to the system in February, which is basically what we were looking for. But remember, these are login and logouts. It may be on the same user. So this is not yet the actual employees. So in order to identify the actual employees, I had to summarize the database by the employee ID, which informed me that these are the 3 employee numbers that who are ex-employees but access the system after their departure date. So this information is ready for me to use. It's ready for me to present to the stakeholders, but there's still more for me that I can do with the data that I have. So let's go back to our file. Let me just close all of these. And remember the second objective. The second objective was that we needed to know whether there were any logins outside of normal working hours. For this company, the working hours are from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So we have a field here, the event time, which represent basically when did the event happen. In our case, the event is the actual login or logout. So what I did is that I again applied another equation to the system. The equation was, I put the equation here that would define the actual working hours, and I just added a parameter to negate all of it. So my equation was, give me the event time that is bigger than 7 and less than 7 p.m. Since I used an and between them, it gave me all of the event times that are between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. But I then used a not parameter, which negated all of this. So it gave me everything other than the event times between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. And it gave me a single transaction where you can see that the event time is appearing at 11 p.m., which is another piece of information that I can present to my stakeholders. Let's continue with our objective. The third objective was we needed to know whether unauthorized access took place on a weekend by an employee who's not authorized to work on a weekend. So we have the access date here, the exact day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, whatever it is. And we have the date. And let's remember that we have the weekend work. We have N for no, and we have Y for yes. So we are looking for someone basically who is a no and a weekend. So let's see what the equation was on that point. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong database. So I've used a built-in function within IDEA to extract all of the days where the day field, which is this field, was a Saturday or a Friday. And I asked the system to make sure that another criteria be applied, which is that the weekend work is equal to N, meaning that the person is not authorized to access the system on a weekend. It's a simple equation that gave me 32 records of logins and logouts on a weekend. But since these are login and logouts, we need to know the exact person who did these. So this is done just by another summarization on employee ID. And it seems that this was done by 2 employees, which can also be submitted to the potential stakeholders for their decision making. And finally, remember that we said that we have a current asset list that are assigned to each employee ID. So since we have the complete file of the actual logins in February from the IDs in those files, we can just run a test to see a very simple equation here, whether the login ID from the current asset file did not match with the login ID from the February access log file. And by just running this simple equation, we find that there has been one access attempt by the same person where it's login and logout, who used a different system that has not been registered with the company's assets. So with that, we have achieved our objectives. We have identified the complete steps and complete methods that we have used that allowed us to achieve our objectives, because documentation is key. So you need to document everything that you have done that allowed you to reach your objective in order for the stakeholders to make an informed decision on what action they need to do. So this has been an example of data analytics on IT-related information, IT login information. Now I'm going to ask my colleague Hisham to show us an example on running data analytics to detect fraud on HR and payroll. So Hisham, can you please take over?
Thank you, Zaid. Thank you all for attending. Today I'll be going with you through a practical example on HR and payroll fraud. So let me just first give a small introduction on HR and payroll fraud. So payroll is one of the largest outlays of every organization. And although a lot of internal controls and internal processes are there, such as segregation of duties, they help to mitigate certain risk of payroll fraud. They don't actually prevent them from occurring. And as an example of these frauds can include having ghost employees in the payroll, the people that are not employed and actually are in the payroll, overpayment, especially when there are certain overtime. We call them also timesheet fraud, or commission, when there is a commission for certain sales, especially if employees, they are working in sales and they receive certain commission or a certain rate of commission. So they could be a little bit inflated to increase the payroll. So I'm not going to get into details of the type of fraud. I'll just get into the case. So the case is, actually before the case, I'll just give a small examples of activities that can be identified in analytics. We have some tests that can be done related to unrelated employees, maybe using the same address or same home or for phone. By that, we'll be able to identify if they are receiving salaries twice, or same employees using the same bank account number under a different name or different employee ID. These are suspicious activities, and we can highlight these red flags using the data analytics by running regular tests on the payroll file. Also, other tests can identify specifically gaps in check numbers, especially if we're paying in checks, or even we can identify if there is a high number of cash payment of salaries or in the payroll file. So all of these tests can be done on the analytics tool. And as I said, I'll be going directly to the case. And the case background is, again, for the same contract cleaning service company. It has locations it has services in different locations. And the CEO is concerned that the expenses witness a significant increase in the month of February. The payroll expenses, the salary expenses witness a significant increase. And he asked you as an analyst to do an analytical review over the payroll to identify if there is any suspicious transactions on the payroll file. And the objective of this review will include the following: identify if a former employee was or former employees were included in the timesheet after their departure. If there is any overlapping, identifying if there is overlapping between employees who work in different locations. So let's say they have recorded hours in location 1, but these same hours are located in location 2 or 3. Also, one of the objectives of the test is to identify non-authorized staff that were paid for weekend working. And the last test that you want to check and you want to verify whether the overtime pay was claimed correctly and there is no overpayment to certain employees. So I know my objective. I know what the test is taking me to. And I've been provided with certain data. The CEO has supplied me with the following information. He told me these are the available files. So they have an employees master file. They have the February payroll file, list of departing employees, and the current pay rate for every employee and the timesheets for the employees. So I'll be going through each test. So the test that we'll be doing is identifying first the former staff working after the departure date. And for this test, I'll be using different files. I'll be linking them together. I'll be integrating them together to build a complete file and find the analysis if there is any employee that's recorded as working employee after his or her departure. So what I'll be doing is I'll be using first my February login file. It's a file that has the weekend, if the employee is allowed to work on a weekend, the name, the base, the location of the base, working at, again, the employee ID, the date of the login, day in, day out, time in, time out, and time PM. Also, other files that were included, I have the pay rate, which just shows if he's a full-time employee over a part-time employee, and for full-time you have certain rate, and for part-time you have different rate. So the full-time employees are not allowed to work overtime, while part-time employees are allowed. So the data here is telling me that. We also have the list of current employees, which shows again the employee ID, the name, the gender of the employee, the joining date, the location of work, the hours in the contract that's specified. So he or she, depending on the type of working, if they are full-time or part-time, they cannot exceed these contract hours, or if they are allowed to work for overtime, they can exceed the contract hours. Again, it specifies other details on the type, either full-time, part-time, the pay rate, and so on. Also, I have a third file, which is the previous employee sheet. And the previous employee sheet just shows the employee that departed from the company. Again, the same leaving date, it shows just the leaving date that is different. So again, we were concerned in the month of February, and we have been informed with a tip that certain employees have left in the middle of the month. So let's see what are the analysis that we can run on for this file. So again, I'll be using the February login sheet as my first analysis, and my first test would be just to identify the working hours for employees, because sometimes to identify the working hours per employee. I'm sorry. So the February login file, the purpose that I want is to identify the time worked for each employee. So I did a simple equation, which is identifying the difference between the in AM and out AM, so the morning shift, and again in PM and out PM, so the night shift, and I identified the difference in this field. My second test that I want to do is to link this file, the February login file. You can see the details of this file with the previous employee list. And again, this list, as we mentioned, has the date of departure for each employee. So I've created a link. This link is, I created a file called previous employee login. This file, again, is a connection between the first file and the second file. I've used match only because I just want I'm concerned with the previous employee. I matched them on the common key, which is the employee ID, and I connected them. Once they are connected, we noted that there is several 84 records noted. I'm accounting for 3 employees. So these are the name of the employees: Janelle Ben, Scotty Kingsland, and Nemika Wilden. Remember the tip that we were provided with, that certain employees might have worked in the first few days in February, but they left in the last 10 or 15 days. So we need to do an equation to identify or to extract just the employees that had working hours, or they had noted working hours after their departure. And for that, we did an extraction, and we highlighted that there is only one employee, which is Scotty Kingsland. Her departure date, if we can see, let me just show you. This day of working is 13th of February, although her departure date is the 5th of February. That's why we noted this as a finding, and we reported this as a finding. So this is our first step, to identify former staff that left after their departure. So our second test is to identify whether there is an overlapping in working hours for staff working in multiple locations. And with this test, we are concerned of knowing whether there is an employee who works in different locations using the login file. He works in different locations. As we said, the login file shows the location. But at the same time, there is an overlapping between his time in and his time out in the different location. And quite simply for this test, I'm just going to do, first of all, I'm just going to filter out the working hours. So you can see some employees, they have 0 hours. So I'm just going to filter out the ones that have working hours. I'll create them in a separate database. I call it records with hours worked. And what I'll be doing next is, from this database, I'll be just getting a duplicate on the employees that have the same ID and the same working date. So I'm just going to specify the duplicate, employee ID, and employee working date. We can see that there is this same employee, Sandy Heckle. It was identified as duplicate, and she works in 2 different locations, yet in the same date, yet she had a time in recorded from 9 to 1, we can see here. Let me just zoom it a little bit. From 9 to 1, and you have a time in night shift and time out in the night shift from 12:20 to 6. So we have noted that this employee, there is an overlapping between the time in and the time out, especially if when she was working the night shift in a location and the morning shift in another location. So again, we've noted that. We can just use it. You can just export it and report it as a finding from our analysis. So this was that second test. Again, you can see how we build this relationship between the files. And once we have built this relationship, we were able to do the simple analysis next. So the third test is to identify whether there is non-authorized staff that were paid for weekend working. And here my concern would be the staff that worked during weekends, but they are not authorized to work during weekends. So to do that, I'll just again use the February login file. And what I'll be doing is, you can see that the weekend, there is this column, weekend allowed and not allowed. And what I'll be just doing is to extract the ones that were working while they have an N. They are not allowed to work on weekend. And I'll just add a criteria to filter out on Sunday and Saturday, consider them the weekend there. So what I'll be getting is a separate database. Let me show you the analysis that we have done. Just created a parameter, which is time worked is more than 0 hour. So he worked at least an hour or a minute or whatever. Weekend allowed equal N, which means weekend is not allowed. And the day is S, either Saturday or Sunday. And I just click OK, and I will get this database. And it shows me that there are 9 employees, actually 9 records for 2 employees, Lavelle Remande and Astrid Boyd, who worked on weekends, who have recorded records on weekend, yet they don't have any approval to work on a weekend. So I have this result, I can resolve them, I can report them easily. So this is the third case that we had to check. And our fourth and last case is pretty much the more complicated one, is to verify whether there is the correctness of overtime pay to employees, and there was no overpayment to certain employees. And for this test, first of all, I want to filter out the employees that, I want to categorize the employees into 2 categories. From the pay rates, we can see that there are 2 categories of employees, the full-time employees and the part-time. So the part-time employees are allowed to work on overtime with a rate of $8, while the full-time employees are not allowed to work as part-time. So again, I need to create this relationship between the employees. But first of all, I want to know the contracted hours for each employee. To know that, I need to go to the current employee file. I want to link this file with the pay rate to know how much the pay rate for each contracted hour. So here the contracted hour per employee is 40, and there are employees with 20. So I just want to create this link between this file and the pay rate. And the result of the connection will be the current employee's pay rate. The linkage was based on the key that was common was either he's a full-time or a part-time to identify the rate. And then we created this link and we got this database, which has 46 employees, the details of their contract and the details of their pay rate. So as soon as I've done that, I want to link this database, which has the current employee details, with my payroll to identify how much I paid to each employee. So I make the payroll file as my master database. As you can see, this is the payroll file. It has for week 1, for each employee, the salaries were paid on a weekly basis. We have 4 weeks. And for each week, it defines the hour worked, whether there are any overtime hours, and the total pay for a week. So if he worked 40 hours times 10, the rate, he will get 400 for a week. So this is what we were informed with. The next step is to identify whether it's a full-time or a part-time and the terms of the contract, the working hours required as per the contract. So I've created this database which links the payroll file with the current employee sheet. Again, the linkage was based on the common key, which is the employee ID, and I've extracted this database, which shows the employee, the total pay per week, the contract required, and the pay scale, which is 1, which is full-time, which is $10, or 2, which is $8. So what I'll be doing now is I'll be extracting the ones that have for employee ones, I'll be extracting the ones that have overtime, where they shouldn't be, while they are not allowed to have overtime. And for pay scale 2, which are the part-time employees, I will check whether the overtime was properly accounted for. So what I'll be doing is I'll be doing this extraction for pay 1, which is a simple equation. It just identifies the employees that are pay scale 1. They are overtime, their overtime is 0, and their total pay exceed 400. So I'm just checking whether there is a breach on the required overpay. And I created this database, which shows for me this employees, which are 5 employees. Their overtime pay is 0. The hours worked are 40, yet the rate should be $10. So if we just multiply 40 times 10, it's 400. So we just want to know the difference between the total pay and the total required pay. And they were overpaid by $200, $160, and so on. For pay scale 2 case, what we have done is we have done quite similar analysis, and we have checked whether there was certain overtimes for the employees, whether there are hours worked more than the contracted hours for each employee. And we have done this analysis, and we noted the following. So these employees worked 20 hours, and if you remember, the rate was $8, and they were paid more than required pay. And this is the difference in the pay. And by that, we were able to identify our 4th and last test and the objective of the test. And I conclude my part. Now I leave the room for Uthman, who will be discussing more on procurement fraud and how to detect them and combat them.
Thank you, Hisham. Hello, everyone. And let us discuss procurement fraud and provide you with a practical example on procurement fraud. Now, before we start talking about procurement fraud, I'd like to ask you this question. Which of the following is a procurement fraud scheme? Ex-employees still accessing the system, overcharging for cost, ghost employees. Can we? As the majority of you have guessed, procurement fraud will involve overcharging for cost. Now, procurement fraud is the deliberate deception intended to influence any stage of the procure-to-pay cycle in order to make a financial gain or cause a financial loss. Procurement fraud can be conducted by internal employees or by contractors or subcontractors or third parties that we are in contracts with. Now, common procurement fraud schemes include false claims, mischarging or overcharging cost or labor, covering prices, and bid rigging. Now, procurement fraud is very difficult to detect. However, data analytics can help in proactively identifying early early warning indicators and red flags of procurement fraud. Example of data analytics and how they can be used in procurement fraud include comparing bank details and addresses of suppliers against those of staff to identify conflict of interest, duplicate testing to identify duplicate invoices from same suppliers, and extracting payments coded as goods or services, additional goods or services charges. Now, in our case study today, I would like you to assume that you are an internal auditor of a company and you received an allegation from a whistleblower hotline indicating that an employee identified as AD in his initials, so the employee initials is AD, has colluded with suppliers to extract cash from the company. You have been tasked to examine if there is sufficient evidence to support the allegation and to check for possible fraudulent activity. Now, the data you require for this purpose or for this investigation is the employee master file, the supplier master file, product master file, purchase invoices, list of purchase order, and list of payments. Now, given that the employee reported had the initials of AD, my first test will be an initial search for employees in my employee database that have initials of AD. The second test for me would be to identify employees to supplier links. So these are the employees who share similar details to our suppliers. So maybe their bank accounts are the same, or maybe their addresses are the same. So I want to identify these. If I do identify any, then these might be considered as ghost suppliers. And I will identify all the payments made to these ghost suppliers. And then after that, I will, of course, try to identify the employees who authorized the payments to these ghost suppliers. I will also gather all invoices submitted by the ghost suppliers and try to identify the employees who entered these invoices on the system. I will also identify if purchase orders were submitted to the ghost suppliers. And the last test for me would be identify non-preferred suppliers and payments processed to non-preferred suppliers. Now let us get to the system. And you can see in here that I have my employee master file. Again, our first test was to identify all employees who had the initials of AD. Now you can see that in my database, I have the payroll ID, name, address, and all other information relating to the employees. Now you can see that in my name field here, I have the last name, the surname, and the first name after it. Now I need to conduct a simple equation to ask the system to retain the first letter from the first name and then the first letter from the last name for each employee. I already conducted that, and you can see that I have the employee initials in here. Now the next step for me is to identify possible AD employees. Now to do that is very easy. All I have to do is create an equation and directly extract the records of all employees who have AD initials. And you can see in here that we have 3 records. So 3 employees who have the initials of AD. 2 of them work in the accounting department and 1 of them work in the administration department. Now, these are good results. I can save them now for future reference, but they do not indicate the scheme nor any suspicious transactions. The second test for me requires me to merge the employee supplier database, the employee master file with the supplier database to identify any links between our employees and suppliers. Now, using my tool here, I was able to match employees' bank accounts with supplier bank accounts, employees' bank accounts sort code with suppliers' bank account sort code. Another test would be, for example, to match employees' addresses with supplier addresses. Now, upon running this test in here, I got 1 matching item. So we have 1 employee who has a bank account and the bank sort code that matches with a supplier. Now, however, the bad thing about the results is the employee's initial is not AD. The employee's initials are Shauna. And I'm now thinking, did I uncover a new fraud scheme, or is Shauna colluding with whoever employee AD is? But what I do have for now is a supplier code, a ghost supplier code, and I can use this code in the rest of the tests. So what I will do now is go on and identify all to my payments database and directly extract all payments made to the ghost supplier. I can easily filter on supplier codes that are equal to supplier P2827, which is the ghost supplier. Once I do that, you'll see that IDEA generated all the transactions or payment details for me. We paid a total of $98,800 to this ghost supplier. I also have the authorized by, so who authorized the payments? And I can immediately detect that only 2 employees authorized the payments to this particular supplier. But that's not enough information for me now. I want to identify who these employees are. So I merge the payments linked to ghost supplier database, the one that I just created, with the employee master file. And again, the matching key in this case was the authorized by and the authorization code available in the employee master file. And there you have it, an employee named Albert Durate, which means he has the initials of AD, and this is the employee I was looking for. However, I have another employee, which is Elva. And upon further investigation, I realized that Elva and Albert share the same bank account and same bank sort code. Now, the next, I have one item that I need to uncover still, which is who is entering the supplier invoices on the system. So who is entering the invoices of this ghost supplier on our system? So I go to my payments database. And again, I extract all invoices. I conduct a direct extract on all invoices that relate to this ghost supplier. And I match this database, the invoices from ghost supplier, to my employee master file to identify who is the user that entered these invoices on the system. And I note immediately that all invoices for this ghost supplier were entered by Shauna. So I have uncovered the full scheme now. Shauna set up the supplier on the system. Shauna is entering the supplier invoices on the system. Albert and Elva are authorizing the payments to this particular supplier. But I don't want to stop here. I want to see if we're dealing with and we're authorizing payments to non-preferred suppliers. So what I do is I go to my supplier master file. This contains all the details of the suppliers we are dealing with. And I have another file, which is the product master file. Now the product master file contains the preferred supplier. So this file contains all the preferred supplier, and the supplier master file contains the details of all suppliers, regardless if they are preferred or not. Now, what I do first is identify all the preferred suppliers. So I merge the supplier master file with the product master file. And the key in here would be supplier code. I generate all matches between both databases. And I have the list of my preferred suppliers. Now, to identify the list of non-preferred suppliers, I had to merge my supplier master file with the preferred suppliers. However, the results will only contain records with no secondary match. What does that mean is that these are the records that are available in the supplier master file, but are not available in the preferred supplier. And immediately, once I generate the results, I get to know that we are dealing with, or we have dealt with, 19 suppliers who are not on our preferred list. So they are non-preferred suppliers. Again, I don't want to stop here. I want to see how many invoices, how many payments did we make to these non-preferred suppliers, and who authorized these payments to the non-preferred suppliers. And I joined the payments with employee name file to the non-preferred suppliers. And once I generate these, I find out that we processed around $3 million nearly to non-preferred suppliers. And once I summarize the data by employee name, I can immediately note that Albert and Elva were responsible for all of these payments, or have authorized all these payments. Now, all of these results are ready for me now just to send to the stakeholders or audit committee in that case. Now, I could continue on. I could conduct, for example, a test on the VAT that has been charged to these non-preferred suppliers. Maybe Albert or Elva have manipulated the VAT percentages for these. But there is also one essential test that a sound data analytics tool should allow me to do, which is the Benford law. Now, if I go to the payments with employee name, I can run a Benford law test. Now, what does the Benford law do, or what does the Benford law state, is that certain numbers in your database should be repeated at a certain percent. So for example, in Benford law, the number 1 should be repeated around 31.4% in your database, while the number 9 should be repeated 4.5, I think, percent. So if you have, for example, the number 9 reaching this 4% limit, it could indicate that there is a suspicious transaction. Now, all I have to do is basically click on OK, and the tool will run the Benford law analysis for me. Now, if I click on 2 digits in here, you'll identify that we have numbers that breach the normal trend line or the upper bound limit in Benford law. Let us extract or display these suspicious records. And guess what? All of these payments or to non-preferred suppliers that IDEA has identified for me were authorized mostly by Albert and Elva. I have another suspicious record in here. And if I look at it again, all of these were processed merely by Albert and Elva. Now, of course, the tool will generate databases containing, Benford law first digit, 3 digits, or 2 digits, etc. Now we're done with our analysis and we uncovered the scheme. We need to talk about how to report our data analytics result and what is a general good practice in reporting data analytics result, and what are the benefits of data analytics in reporting. Now, the benefits of data analytics in reporting cover the entire reporting cycle for an audit engagement. For example, in preliminary communication, data analytics allows you to examine the data before you conduct the kickoff meeting. It allows you to gain a better understanding of the client business activities and transactions. And therefore, and imagine this for me, you're conducting the meeting, you're aware of the trends in the data, you're aware of unusual transactions, so you'll definitely have a more productive kickoff meeting. And the second reporting aspect that data analytics would help you with is interim communication. During today's examples, you saw how fast it is for us to identify significant issues. You saw how fast it is for you to identify unusual items, and you can report these unusual or suspicious transactions immediately to your key stakeholders. Now, in the final communication, data analytics can help you in 2 aspects. The first is, you saw today, we were examining the entire population. So we were not selecting samples. We were examining the entire supplier master file. We were examining the entire employee master file. And that gives the board or senior management 100%, of the data, and we're giving them assurance that 100% of the data was analyzed. Therefore, our coverage is more and our added value is more. The second aspect is that data analytics allows you to use graphical illustration, which allows us to explain complex data and critical issues better. And again, we described the benefits of data visualization in our previous session. Now, I'm going to raise the next poll question, which is, which of the following should be included in your final engagement report? Data obtained but not used in the analysis, steps followed to reach the conclusion, or a table containing all records examined regardless of the size. And you've all answered, the majority of you have answered correctly. It's the steps followed to reach the conclusion. Data obtained but not analyzed should not be included in the reports, and tables containing all records should definitely not be included in the report, especially if we're not considering the size of these. Now, since we're talking about reporting, we cannot exclude, the importance of developing working papers that document sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information as per the standards, or as per the IIA standards. Now, the following are aspects that, out of good practice, you want to consider to include in your working papers, which is titles that identify the engagement. You should have clear titles that identify the engagement. The purpose of the engagement, or the purpose of the working paper. For each working paper, you should document a purpose. For example, my first working paper, I identified all employees with AD initials, and I need to document that purpose. Indexing, you should always index your working papers. Time of the engagement, you may want to include the time of the engagement. The source of information, so in today's exercise, we relied on the employee master file. We relied on the supplier database, and we can include the sources from which we obtained such information. If you selected samples, then it's a good practice to include the population, sample size, and means of selecting the sample. And again, if you used analytical methods, you can document the methods you used, the results of the tests and the analysis, and your conclusion, and you should ensure that your conclusions are cross-referenced to your observations. Also, you can include the name of the internal auditors that were involved in the engagement, and you should include the review notions and name of the reviewers. Now, it's also essential or good for you to summarize the information. So your working paper should summarize the information and focus on the most important information. Internal audit team leaders or audit supervisor or engagement supervisor should review working papers, and evidence indicating their review should be available. Now, I'll leave it to Mr. Nasser to conclude this session and the entire webinar. Mr. Nasser.
Thank you, Uthman. All right, so you've seen a detailed example of 3 types of fraud that can be detected using data analytics. One of them being HR and payroll, procurement, and IT login attempts or IT login fraud. So moving on to the next slide, Uthman, or Zaid. Unlocking the potential of data analytics. Now, I wanted to highlight before we move on to this section that there are many other types of fraud in data analytics, so it doesn't have to be fraud that we look for. This session is about fraud, so we brought up those 3 examples. There are many other examples of fraud relating to revenue fraud, fixed asset fraud. So actually, the system that we use has built-in tests that comes with it. In an add-on tool called special for the those types of tests, so you can run with the various database. Smart Analyzer, it's called. So on that section, we're going to talk about how you unlock the potential of data analytics. And I would call it, this is the approach we recommend for a successful implementation. So, because data analytics is just like any other big and important project in the organization. I mean, it's not as costly. I mean, the cost of data analytics tool is not high, but it definitely requires buy-in from, first of all, your own employees as a chief audit officer, or if you are a data analyst in an organization or in the finance department, you need the buy-in of the stakeholders in general. You need to start with the vision. You need to explain to them what is it that you want to achieve in the end. And after that, you put the steps, clear steps towards the goal of achieving that vision. Then you need to manage the stakeholders' expectations. Just like any other project, the success of the project relies on the defined objectives. Okay? You want to be sure you communicate the correct objectives that you plan to achieve and by when. Remember, the data analytics is a journey. We talked about it in the last session, and we talked about how you can go all the way from basic data analytics to really advanced artificial intelligence and robotics. So you need to manage the stakeholders' expectation with clear timelines and clear objectives, especially that stakeholders today are much more demanding than they were many years ago. They require the internal auditor to add value. They require the internal auditor to address risks. And the fact that that they are demanding, they expect more. So with data analytics, you want to be sure that it is 100% something that is properly defined and properly set. Your objectives are clearly set with the stakeholders. Then you need to integrate risk, and this starts with with the internal audit plan. So if your internal audit plan is not risk-based, think again, and you have to make it risk-based. Similarly, data analytics have to address risks, because the language of risk is what the business language is. So people will understand you better. You'll be able to address their concerns, and you'll be able to concentrate your data analytics on the more important areas as well. Following that, you have to optimize internal processes. One of the major benefits to be derived from data analytics is optimizing processes. And I cannot overemphasize that. I'm talking about just efficiency of the process. I'm talking about also the controls in the process and how you can automate the testing of controls to make sure the processes remain working continuously and the controls in the processes remain working continuously. And finally, align people and technology. The most important element in the whole exercise is people, your people, the auditors. They need to adopt and embrace the technology. They need to learn it well. And there are elements to the success of that. The attitudes, motivations, capacity of learning, ability to understand processes are all key to the success of this project. So with that, I conclude, but I want to show you that the data analytics process will start with so much data in the organization that when you look at it, it doesn't make sense. Data analytics, disciplined, focused data analytics will allow you to organize it and make sense of the data. It will help you in decision making. It will help you, as my colleagues showed today, detect fraud. It will help you test controls. It will help you assess how effective these controls are, and so on and so forth. So uses of data analytics are limitless, and the benefits to be derived are major. So with that, we would stop, and I will start receiving questions from the attendees, not only me, but my colleagues as well, Hisham, Uthman, Zaid, and I. Questions, gentlemen? Ladies? Okay. So far we don't have any questions. All right. Now, with regards to the material, in agreement with our partners, the IIA, ISACA, and the Institute of Management Accounting in Jordan, we've agreed that we will send you a link to access the material and the database, the presentations as well. So we shall be sending you an email in that regard. And for the CPEs, of course, for those of you who attended, they will have the opportunity to apply for CPE hours as well through the Institute of Internal Auditor, ISACA, or IMA, depending on what chapter you are registered in. Okay, so I will let my colleague Zaid address the issue of the email.
It came to our understanding that there were many attendees who did not register using their emails. So if there are any attendees who wish to have a copy of the presentation, we require you to send your emails to us or to the host in order to register you, for you to be able to have access to this presentation and the slides. The email is aigcwebsite@adarco.com. I'll ask the host if he can send it as a message to everybody for their reference, please, Yusuf.
Okay, while we are discussing, while Yusuf sends the email, there is a question regarding PDUs for ISACA members. Can we claim our PDUs for ISACA members? I will answer as I understand from Mr. Hussam Khattab that those who attended and participated in the sessions will be receiving CPE hours for that, or PDUs. So yes, the answer is you need to apply. But of course, you need, those who have attended will be the ones to receive that. Mr. Muhammad Mustafa, how is your system different from other systems in the market in terms of data analytics? Well, data analytics systems are very similar. And, they are similar, but some of them have different advantages depending on your objectives. We tend to use IDEA Data Analytics because it was developed by auditors. So it has a lot of tests that, because we are, as a firm, we outsource internal audits. So we have a team of more than 30 professionals that specialize in internal audit, risk management, risk assessment, compliance. So we need those built-in tests in the system that help us a lot in our work. Because it was developed by auditors. So all of those tests that the Hisham, Uthman, and Zaid covered today, most of them are built into the system. The system runs them for you as soon as you define them. And then you record them, and then you can automatically run them again at any point in time. In fact, you can schedule that the system does it for you at specific points in time. So it does help our audit assignments. So my colleague has shared the email that you need to send for those who haven't registered and gave us their emails. Please send your email to AIGC website @aldarco.com. A question from Ms. Lubna Saadi. IDEA don't require integration with core system, right? No, it doesn't. So it can import data directly from any database. So whatever the core system is, it can import the data into IDEA.
If I can add a point to this question here. So when we say that IDEA, it actually depends on the security policy of your company. Some companies do refuse to integrate IDEA or any other external system with the core system. And in such a situation, you would require to extract the reports from the core system to whatever kind of format and then import it into IDEA. If the IT department or security policy allows integration, that's when you can extract the information directly from the system.
Thank you, Zaid. So a question from Mr. Amr Kurdi. Shall we send email to you or the CPEs? All the CPEs will be added to our account with ISACA. The answer is, depending on the session that you attended, if you already registered and gave your email, then there is no problem because we already have the attendance record. But if you haven't registered, we need your email, so you need to send us your email, and accordingly, we will communicate with ISACA and they will get it. Mr. Al-Saadi, I have attended the first and third session. Yes, you had the option to attend any of the sessions. So whatever session you attended, you will be receiving CPE hours on. However, if your question relates to whether you can access the material relating to the second session, then the answer is yes, you will be able to access the material in the recording for the second session. Another question from Ms. Saade, do you provide training if the software is purchased? Yes, it's always, we do provide training. The good thing about data analytics, IDEA data analytics tool is that there are different types of standard trainings available, and videos and recordings and different types of material to get engaged and quickly up and running. Ms. Sophie Karmash, the question is, are session 1 and 2 archived? Yes, they're going to be made available to you. So we have recorded them, and you will have access to the recording as well. Okay, I think we don't have any more questions. Okay, with one more question. Okay, Mr. Omar Saras, in terms of automation, can your system automate the data upload process from a certain location, or maybe connect to other systems' databases to extract data? So the question is about automating the data upload process. I'm not a technical person, so I'll ask my colleagues to help me out.
I can answer on that. Yes, you can just define the source and define in the script the source of information, and you can link it directly.
Thank you, Hisham. Mr. Hussain Kazemi, can you name a similar system to IDEA? There are many other systems. Let me tell you, for example, Excel is a competitor to IDEA. So, Excel is a tool that is used for data analytics. However, it has its limitations. We cannot use it as auditors because it does not maintain the source data. You can easily delete the data, change it, the source data. So IDEA maintains the source data. Any test you conduct on IDEA is saved for you as an auditor. And as Othman was talking about the working papers, it's kept for you as a documented working. If you select a sample, it's kept for you as well. So there are many tools available. Some of them have different advantages. Some of them are more powerful in the graphical aspect. But in terms of audit purposes, whether IT audit or general audit purposes, IDEA has a special strength because it is developed by auditors. Okay, so with that, I conclude our session today, and this will be our last session. I want to thank all of our presenters, Zaid, Othman, and Hisham, for the time they took to prepare the material and present it. I'd like to thank you all for attending with us today and for taking the time in the evening to attend with us. It was a real pleasure to sit with a professional team like yourselves. And special thanks one more time to the Institute of Internal Auditors and its president, Mr. Ahmed Al-Khawasmi, IMA-Jordan and the president Naseem Qarmash, and Mr. Hussain Khattab, the president of ISACA, and of course Iman Boutai, the operation manager at IMA-Jordan. Without them, it couldn't have happened. We really worked very closely together to develop the content and deliver the material and make sure that we address the concerns of their members. So thank you one more time. Thank you all for attending. I hope you got the benefit that you were looking for, and we hope you stay in touch. Any question you have, we will definitely be sharing our emails with you, as my email and my other colleagues' emails. So whether or not you have a question relating to data analytics in general, about ideas, tool and specific, or we would love to stay in touch with you. So feel free to contact us anytime. And with that, I conclude the session. I thank you all, and you have a great evening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Bye-bye.